Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And that was said by Paulo Freire. Well, welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Max Igan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Well, folks, it's certainly been an interesting week this week. There's a lot of things going on, and a certain ramping up of the New World Order agenda, which of course goes so deep, folks, it's hard to even explain to people in a nutshell what the agenda is, because the spectrum is so huge of what we're actually facing here. But what we're seeing here in Australia, which is very much the front line as much as any other country, in fact, even more so in some ways, because here in Australia we have been disarmed. We are the first country that has ever been disarmed since World War II. And this was done, of course, due to the Port Arthur massacre that happened in Australia in 1996. And, of course, there is an abundant amount of evidence that exists which can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at the Port Arthur massacre, and it's very likely the whole thing was a false flag operation staged by the government. Even the weapon that was used is a weapon that had been confiscated by Victorian police a year earlier. And Martin Bryant was, of course, a mentally handicapped young man who had no shooting experience, and we are told that he managed to pull off what has been the most accurate shooting spree we've ever seen from any mass killing, any mass murder. The Port Arthur massacre saw the death of 35 people and, as I said, shot in a very accurate manner. And there's an abundant amount of evidence out there, folks, which heavily disputes the government version of events. Martin Bryant's mother also says that she has never seen any evidence to indicate that the killer was her son, and it just goes on. And as I said, very credible evidence that heavily disputes the government's version of events does exist, and it exists in the public domain. So I suggest you do your research on the Port Arthur massacre as well. And this, of course, happened the year after little Johnny Howard, who we love to call Mr. Magoo, coincidentally, of course, signed off on most of the deals which would allow things such as coal seam gas mining to be carried out in this country. So it would appear that back then they already figured out what they were going to do to this nation, and they thought, well, the people aren't going to like this, so we'd better get all their weapons off them so that we can get away with what we're about to do. But anyway, look, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, so getting back to the topic, what we've seen happen here in Australia in the last week is we've seen the introduction of legislation which will introduce full body scanners into the airports in Australia. I believe this is happening around about July, which is around about the same time the carbon tax is due to come in. And this is happening at the same time as these very same body scanners are being banned across Europe, across all of Europe, because they actually use a terahertz wave which literally shreds your DNA. And this has been shown, and so they're being banned right across Europe by the European Union, and at the very same time they're being introduced into Australia. And not only that, they're being made mandatory for any international travellers that come into this country or leave this country are required to go through these body scanners. Now, this is a precursor for what they will soon be doing around the rest of the planet as well, if they can get away with it here, which unfortunately they are likely to because of the apathetic nature of the Australian people, who tend to only believe what their television tells them. Although hopefully we may see a few people wake up to the corruption that does exist within the governmental structure in this country. And something that might actually help do this is the release of a new film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's called Expendable. I have it actually featured on the Crowhouse homepage at the moment. If you go to thecrowhouse.com, you will find the film right there on the homepage. Just scroll down a little bit and there it is. And I'm also featuring it periodically on my YouTube channel as well. And you can go to expendable.tv, which is the website. And this website and this film contains enough information to virtually bring down the Australian Federal Police and to expose the corruption that exists in the highest levels of our government. Admittedly, the film deals with the Howard government that existed a few years ago, but unfortunately the corruption that's referred to in this film is inherent within the entire political system and most especially within the Australian Federal Police, who work hand in hand with the politicians. And the film relates to a lady called Schapelle Corby, who was arrested in Bali in 2004 and sentenced to 20 years jail in 2005 for smuggling drugs into Bali that can now be proven to not have been hers. And this film exposes what happened and how the Australian government not only ignored the evidence but ensured that this young woman would be convicted, because a verdict of innocent would have caused an investigation into the drug running that happens at Australian airports, with which the Australian Federal Police are very likely heavily involved. And so I highly recommend that everybody view this film. If you're listening to this show in Australia, I highly recommend that you go to expendable.tv and watch the film, download a copy of it, and get it out to your friends and neighbours. Tell everybody about it, because every Australian needs to see this film. And look, we're not talking about a Hollywood production here, folks, okay? It's just it's a low-budget film. It's just a group of people who are desperately trying to get their research out to the people of Australia. So please bear with the quality of the production and simply look at the information that it is presenting to you, because not only is it very effective at demonstrating the level of corruption that exists within our government, but a young woman's life depends on justice prevailing, and this will only happen with an outcry of public opinion from the people of Australia. It's extremely important, folks, it really is. And I really cannot promote this film to you enough, so please check it out and please share it with everybody that you can. And remember, folks, that everything that is depicted in this film is still happening at Australian airports. It is still happening, and so any one of you who happens to take a holiday to Bali or a holiday to Thailand or a holiday literally anywhere could very easily find themselves in exactly the same circumstances as Schapelle Corby. And the reason I'm promoting the film so much is because the only way Schapelle Corby is going to be released from jail is with enough public outcry. And so it's important that the people of Australia get on board and make a lot of noise about this, because we simply cannot allow this type of corruption to exist within our government and police systems. And the only people who have any hope at all of addressing the government and police systems are the people of Australia. Because according to our Constitution, we are the ones who hold all the cards, and we are the ones to whom our government is ultimately accountable. But we have to stand up to make it happen. We can't simply let them investigate themselves. We have to get this information out to the community and stand up and make a difference. And we owe it to our children and to all of our descendants to do so. And if we fail to do so, then we're simply freeloading on our children and on our grandchildren. And I feel that it has to be done quickly, folks. In fact, I really believe that we have to get on board and make some positive changes this year. And because these body scanners are being rolled in, we need to do it as quickly as possible. And I urge everybody to investigate the information that exists on these body scanners. You can go to thecrowhouse.com. I've got links there to articles that you need to see. And we have to really look at what's happening in this country. And another very important thing that we have to look at is GM food. GM food is being introduced pretty well across the board in this country. It's completely unregulated. It is not labelled as GM food. And genetically modified food has been proven through scientific testing to cause sterility and organ damage to every animal that they've tested it on. And this occurs about 3 or 4 generations down the track from when the GM diet is introduced. So if you eat GM food, then you are going to find that your grandkids and your great-grandkids are very likely going to be sterile and have very, very damaged organs. And this is exactly why genetically modified food has also been banned across Europe, the same as airport scanners have been banned across Europe. And the thing is that this is all happening on our watch, folks. Our governments have got the whole society, especially within Australia here, they've got this entire country brainwashed on television. They've got all of America brainwashed on television, all of England, most of Europe, although it would appear that the governments in Europe are a little bit more intelligent because they are at least working to ban these very, very damaging items from their continent. But our governments are not. The governments of America, of England, of New Zealand, and most especially of Australia are allowing the people to be used basically as a scientific experiment, because all of the people in Western nations are being genetically altered without their consent and without their knowledge. And I also very much suspect that these full body scanners, which, as I said, are shown to attack DNA, are going to feature very heavily in this genetic modification process, because everything else that they do to us is also designed to attack our DNA. All the genetically modified food attacks your DNA. What is coming down in the chemtrails seems to very much affect your DNA. We've got things like smart meters, mobile phones, this entire electronic culture. There would appear to be a very, very large electromagnetic grid that's being put in place. And Australia really is very much the front line in what's going on here, folks. And if the people of this country do not get up and put things right and reinstate natural law in this country, we are heading for a very dark future indeed. The fact is that the Gillard regime that currently controls this country is the worst government this country has ever seen, and Julia Gillard is little more than a modern-day tyrant of the most psychopathic kind. And she is a tyrant, folks. She is quite literally a tyrant. She simply introduces whichever corrupt and repressive legislation she likes, stages false attacks on herself in order to get a photo op. She was elected on a platform of barefaced lies. She's a disgrace to her country, and she should be in jail. In fact, after watching the film Expendable, one can only come to the logical conclusion that a great deal of Australia's politicians should be in jail, and so it would appear should the highest ranks of the Australian Federal Police Force. They should also be in jail, as should many reporters at the ABC and Channel 7 and probably the rest of Australia's media as well. And the fact that these criminals are running rampant throughout these organisations just goes to show how ineffective and how corrupt the Australian police actually are. As I mentioned on a Sydney breakfast show the other day, the Australian police are simply a criminal gang who have a monopoly on violence. And things will only get worse until the Australian people decide to stand up and reclaim the rights that are inherent to them through the constitution of this country, rather than simply sitting there enjoying television and beer, which is, of course, what most Australians seem to do with their spare time. Go to the pub, watch television, watch sport, or sit around the barbie with a beer while they allow their country, their nation, and their freedoms to be decimated around them, oblivious to any reality other than what the television has told them. Sometimes I just wonder what it's going to take to wake these people up, folks. I really do. Perhaps I'm too calm on these radio shows. Perhaps I should get the claws out a little bit and start screaming at people. Maybe they will wake up then. Maybe they'll appreciate the drama and actually stand up and do something about this situation that we are facing, because it's just getting out of control. The Australian government is completely and utterly out of control. They really are. There was an article in the local newspaper about how the Australian Federal Police have admitted that they are spying on any anti-CSG organisations. Anybody who is organising anything to speak out against coal seam gas, the Australian Federal Police are spying on them, very likely because they consider them to be something similar to a terrorist cell. So, in some ways, because here in Australia we have been disarmed. We are the first country that has ever been disarmed since World War II. And this was done, of course, due to the Port Arthur massacre that happened in Australia in 1996. And, of course, there is an abundant amount of evidence that exists which can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Martin Bryant was. And a certain ramping up of the New World Order agenda, which, of course, goes so deep, folks, it's hard to even explain to people in a nutshell what the agenda is, because the spectrum is so huge of what we're actually facing here. But what we're seeing here in Australia, which is very much the front line as much as any other country, in fact, even more participate in the transformation of their world. And that was said by Paulo Freire. Well, welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Max Igan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again, and I will be your host for the next hour. Well, folks, it's certainly been an interesting week this week. There's a lot of things going on, and education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to not the gunman at the Port Arthur massacre. And it's very likely the whole thing was a false flag operation staged by the government. Even the weapon that was used is a weapon that had been confiscated by Victorian police a year earlier. And Martin Bryant was, of course, a mentally handicapped young man who had no